We now move to First Minister's questions. Question number 1, Joanne Lamont.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the First Minister what engagements he has planned for the rest of the day.
First Minister.
Engagements to take forward the Government's programme for Scotland.
Joanne Lamont.
Thank you. In 2008, as part of the preparations for the Glasgow Airport rail link, 4 plots of land at 57 Clark Street, Paisley, were bought on behalf of the Scottish Government for £840,000. Can the First Minister tell me who the land was bought from, and can he also tell me who the land has subsequently been sold to and for what price?
Minister.
Minister. If Joanne Lamont wants to write to me with these questions, I'll supply the answers. But can I just say to Joanne Lamont, as we heard yesterday, this Government's track record in taking forward transport projects in Scotland under the circumstances of the cutbacks in Westminster is a very considerable one indeed. But by all means, send in the questions and we'll supply the answers.
Joanne Lamont.
Well, there you go, and there's me thinking this was First Minister's questions, where the First Minister had the opportunity to show how much in control of his government he was. Let me help the First Minister. The land was bought in 2008 for £840,000 from a businessman, John McGlynn, then a donor to the Scottish Conservative Party. Since then, of course, Mr McGlynn has been on something of a political journey. Now he supports the Yes campaign. Since then, he's been appointed to the Scottish Government National Economic Forum. And since then, he has bought back the land from the Scottish Government for just £50,000 and made a profit of £790,000. Is there some connection here, or has Mr McGlynn just benefited from the First Minister's gross incompetence with public funds?
First Minister.
Well, as Joanne Lamont, you know, the ministers are not involved in property transactions with regard to transport projects or anything else. Maybe it was different when the Labour Party were in power, but certainly that's the way when the SNP is in power. I wasn't sure if from that question, which clearly Joanne Lamont had her answers all the time, so it wasn't really about listing information. But I wasn't clear whether it was an attack because somebody was a donor to the Conservative Party when the land was bought, or it was just an attack for no apparent reason against a Scottish business person. I mean,
Order.
If Joanne Lamont has any evidence whatsoever that anything untoward has been happening in property transactions, then let her bring it to the Chamber or bring it into the public notice. If she has no evidence, and she has no evidence whatsoever, then don't make attacks on people in Scotland with no reason whatsoever for making them, and come to this chamber and attack people who can't answer back in the chamber. Ridiculous.
Joanne Lamont. Joanne Lamont.
No one. I was expecting the First Minister to justify his actions, and he has absolutely failed to do so. The fact of the matter is, the land was bought by the Scottish Government, signed off by Scottish ministers for £840,000, sold for £50,000 when not obliged to do so, to kill a project John Swinney himself has said was desirable and which Transport Scotland is still at this very moment exploring. In case the First Minister hasn't noticed, for the last 5 years, Scotland has been going through one of the deepest downturns in our history. In that time, the First Minister has slashed spending on skills and colleges. He has underfunded vital public services so some of our most vulnerable old people get just 15-minute care visits. And he has cut funding so that for many people with a bus pass, there isn't a bus to get on. In those circumstances, how does the First Minister justify buying a piece of land for £840,000 and then selling it back to the person he bought it from for just £50,000? What was the First Minister thinking of?
First Minister.
First Minister, or no other minister was involved in the property transactions she speaks of. These are not conducted by ministers in this government. I don't know if the practice was different in the last Labour government. I suspect it wasn't. The purpose of Joanne Lamont seems to be to smear a perfectly respectable Scottish businessman for no apparent reason, and she doesn't like his politics then or now, for that matter. I don't really think that is the way that a political leader should behave in a parliamentary chamber. So now, if Joanne Lamont wants to talk about what she occasionally says the real issues, then let's talk about the real issues. This government has given an unequivocal commitment to universal services and benefits, the mark of the Parliament over these last 14 years. It is Joanne Lamont who, as I understand it, wants to cut people's bus passes, wants to stop the free access to higher education, has put a question mark over free personal care of the elderly. These are matters which, as I understand it, are being considered by her Cuts Commission as part of the Something for Nothing society that she outlined only a year ago. As we said in our programme, we believe in a something for something society in Scotland. We believe these benefits to people in Scotland are well justified, and I think the people of Scotland want to hear about these substantive policies, not totally unfounded smears on a Scottish business person.
Joanne Lamont.
I think we might hear talking about something for next to nothing Scotland. And I am not addressing the question of the businessman who benefits. I am asking the First Minister to take responsibility for what was done by his government. You are a government after all, and all this displacement activity we got here might make the First Minister feel better for just now to get him through the moment, but when he's done with that, he will still have to ask this serious question, because I don't think the First Minister, even at this stage, understands how serious this is. I am asking a simple question. How did we get in a situation where a piece of land was bought with taxpayers' money for the guts of £1 million and sold back to the same person a few years later for just a fraction of that? There are people watching this at home who are struggling to pay the bills or put food on the table. They have to account for every penny they spend. Can the First Minister explain to them either why it's got nothing to do with him or how he managed to buy a piece of land with their money for £840,000 and sold it for just 50?
First Minister.
Neither the valuations for land on purchases or sale are made by Scottish Government ministers, as Joanne Lamont perfectly well knows. Now, if it wasn't, as she said, an attempt to smear a Scottish business person, then why did Joanne Lamont casually mention or read out that he was a donor to the Conservative Party? Why did she say he was on a political journey? Why did she say he was appointed to the Scottish Government Economic Forum? What was that about if it was not a fairly blatant attempt to smear a perfectly respectable Scottish business person in Scotland? So I think people watching will be rather interested and concerned. Are they going to keep their bus passes under Labour? Well, we don't know. The Cuts Commission is still considering. Is Joanne Lamont going to reintroduce tuition fees for Scottish students? Is free personal care safe in Labour's hands? The answer is no to all of these things. She has them in the Cuts Commission, the Something for Nothing society. She doesn't want to talk about the issues that concern the people of Scotland, because people know that Labour have let them down in the past, and if they get the chance, they'll let them down again, which is why she's sitting there reading out the questions, and this government is in office.
Question 2, Ruth Davidson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the First Minister when he'll next meet the Secretary of State for Scotland.
First Minister.
No plans, near future.
Ruth Davidson.
When the First Minister announced his flagship non-profit distribution model in 2010 for big building projects, he promised to invest £686 million this financial year. If you're flicking through your notes, it's page 173 of yesterday's draft budget. Last year, the government had to admit that actually they'd deliver less than half of that at £338 million. And that figure has been revised again. So can the First Minister tell the Chamber what the current estimate for MPD spending on building projects is for 2013-14?
Well, it was laid out, as she rightly says, and the whole capital programme, both the NPD programme rising from 185 in 2013-14 to 809 2014-15 to 932 in 2015-16, was laid out in the budget statement yesterday. And of course, what was also laid out is the total estimated capital investment programme, of which non-profit distribution is a key part. And what that was coming from is from 13-14, £240 million, £4,157 million in 14-15, and £4,438 million in 2015-16. That's £3 billion, £4 billion, and £4,438 million. Now that is an extraordinary achievement of capital investment against cutbacks from the Westminster Government, which started at over 30% and are now just under 30%. So I think most people, looking at these figures, would anticipate that Mr Swinney, under the most extraordinary pressure from Westminster Government, is delivering a capital programme for growth and capital investment in the Scottish economy. And now she has the figures, perhaps she'll have the grace to say that this is an encouraging and productive trend in Scottish society.
An extraordinary blizzard of figures, but not actually the one that I'd asked for. So let's look at that, shall we? The figure that the First Minister wouldn't tell us in there was that of the £686 million that this government promised to invest in big building projects, they now say that they will deliver just £185 million. And that's after a first year when they promised £150 million but delivered nothing. A second year when they promised up to £350 million and delivered just £20 million. Of course, his deputy, who's smiling there sitting next to him, says that it's not incompetence, it's just a reprofiling. 3 years ago, this First Minister promised over £1 billion of investment on big building projects through the MPD scheme, and he's coming up short by over £900 million. His projects, his responsibility, his incompetence. The people of Scotland need to know what has happened to his £1 billion build.
First Minister.
The 185 was the first figure in the blizzard of figures that Ruth Davidson complained about. And let me repeat it, just so that she can get the full importance of it. As the budget document said yesterday, the NPD programme, £185 million in this financial year, £809 million in 2014-15 and £932 million in 2015-16. Now, these are impressive figures for a new system of public finance. Now, let's get the background straight on this. The PFI, the Revenue Finance System, which was beloved of the Labour Party and then the Tories supported it, is no longer a feasible option for revenue-based finance. Everybody agrees that PFI, even George Osborne recently, has come to the conclusion that PFI was a hideous, expensive mistake. Then, of course, there is the funding, the direct capital funding, so beloved of Mr Swinney and so beloved of me, because it enables you to accelerate capital spending, it enables you to deal with recession. That is the one that's been cut by just under 30% by the Westminster Government. That's a cut in capital allocations. So we brought forward a new system of funding, non-profit distribution, which has been demonstrated to provide value for money, which is building schools and colleges across this country at the present moment. And Ruth Davidson comes along and complains about the fact that this new generation of funding has been brought into practice. Because of it's been brought into practice, we now face in Scotland, against Westminster cutbacks, an expanding capital budget over the next 3 years. That will generate jobs, investment and prosperity in the Scottish economy.
Liam MacArthur.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Orkney's internal ferry fleet provides a lifeline to some of our most fragile communities, but it urgently needs replacing. Apparently, however, discussions on funding the replacement programme have broken down, with the chair of Orkney Islands Council's Infrastructure Committee claiming today that the government has, quote, closed the door in our face. With Orkney set to be the only area where ferry services have actually been cut, does the First Minister understand why his government has been accused by Orkney Islands Council this morning of treating my constituents with contempt? And will he now instruct his Minister and Transport officials to get back round the table and agree a practical way forward so that those living in the inner and outer isles in my constituency are not held to ransom by his government's stubbornness?
First Minister.
Well, the premise of the question is not correct. With these discussions, and Nicola Sturgeon would be delighted to meet the constituency MSP. The Government's investment programme in ferry services is a very, very considerable one indeed, and I encourage him to have that meeting as we take forward these discussions.
Neil Findlay.
Given that in the last few weeks 2 hospital wards in my region have already had to close this year to deal with norovirus, why is the Finance Secretary taking £10 million from the budget to support hospital cleaning?
First Minister.
Well, I think the member would do well to look at the achievements in the reduction of hospital-acquired infections over the last few years, which have dropped by dramatic sense in terms of the recorded figures. Some of that, of course, has been done by our decision to stop the privatisation and contracting out of cleaning services to the National Health Service. I know they wouldn't have been supported by Neil Findlay. Unfortunately, they were pursued by the Labour-Liberal administration in this place. And thanks to that and the other measures through the patient safety programme, we are now in a considerably better position with regard to norovirus and other hospital-acquired infections than we've been previously. But of course, we have to be extremely vigilant, and you can be absolutely assured that Alex Neil's Health Secretary will do exactly that.
Question 3, Willie Rennie.
To ask the First Minister what issues will be discussed at the next meeting of the Cabinet.
First Minister.
Issues of importance to the people of Scotland.
Willie Rennie.
The Chair of the Patient Safety Council of the Royal College of Surgeons of Edinburgh raised concerns a few days ago that hospital care at weekends is substantially worse than weekdays. For example, at Hairmyres Hospital in Lanarkshire, the death rate among patients admitted for vascular surgery on Saturday was over 41%, compared with 16% on Tuesday. At Dundee's Ninewell Hospital, it was over 21%, almost double the rate on Tuesday. And in Fife's hospitals, the rates for renal patients admitted at weekends were higher than weekdays. Has the First Minister been able to consider this?
Well, the whole aspect of patient safety across Scottish hospitals is part of the patient safety programme, which, as Willie Rennie will know, has achieved an estimated 12% reduction in standardised mortality rates. Certainly, differentials between days of the week and weekends is one aspect that's been considered. But he will know that Professor Don Berwick, who has been brought in by the coalition government in London to try and deal with the very, very difficult situation across the English Health Service in terms of patient safety, has given the Scottish system introduced in the patient safety programme the accolade of being one of the safest in the world. So I do think that we should recognise the achievement in the patient safety programme, and also recognise that one aspect of that patient safety programme is to look at things like differential rates of mortality between days of the week and weekends. That is part of the continuous improvement on which the patient safety programme is based.
Willie Rennie.
I know we have to be careful, but we've got a duty to ask serious questions about these issues to satisfy ourselves that patients are being kept as safe as possible. But Simon Patterson-Brown, who's the Consultant General Surgeon at the Royal Infirmary of Edinburgh, who's also the Chair of the Safety Board at the Royal College of Surgeons, he said it could well be that the weekend mortality rates in some medical specialities are not statistically significant. But on the other hand, they could be, and unless we are fully investigating this, I don't think anyone can say with certainty either way. I intend to take the matter further. So I recognise that there is processes in place to look at these issues, but I think we need some reassurance about what these surgeons are saying, because these are not insignificant people. This is the Royal College of Surgeons of Edinburgh. When will the First Minister publish a report in response to the surgeons' concerns?
First Minister.
Well, I know that these matters are being looked at the present moment. As I explained to Willie Rennie, that's part of the patient safety approach. And he can be absolutely certain that the aspect of the patient safety programme is to make sure that all matters are properly considered and looked at, and I'll arrange for the Health Secretary to give that detailed information to Willie Rennie. So he can be sure that in response to any aspect which suggests either in individual hospitals where improvements haven't been as quick as in other places in Scotland, or alternatively in differences in standardised mortality rates and patient safety compared with weekdays and the weekends, the patient safety programme has these things under active consideration. And he's perfectly right to raise these points, incidentally, and I hope that nothing in my first answer suggested this wasn't an entirely legitimate area of inquiry. But what I would expect is that Willie Rennie, when he looks at the achievements of the patient safety programme, he looks at the fact that I think 9 out of the 10 recommendations that the Berwick review suggested to try and address some of these questions in hospitals across England, that 9 out of 10 of these recommendations are already in place in Scotland because of that patient safety programme, then he will give genuine credit to the efforts of those in the health service. And it's not just the administrators at the top of the health service, but the nurses, doctors, the consultant, the workers throughout the health service who have brought that impressive improvement in standardised mortality rates through in Scottish hospitals and the Scottish Health Service. So, yes, ask the questions of worrying statistics and opinions of reputable doctors. Yes, absolutely. But acknowledge the general improvement that the patient safety programme has brought to the Scottish Health Service, because that's something in which all of us should share as Scotland's national health service, our public health service, performs so well for the people of Scotland.
Question number 4, Kenneth Gibson.
To ask the First Minister what action the Scottish Government is taking to encourage fostering.
First Minister.
Well, the Government works closely with the fostering network to encourage and support people in becoming foster carers. We have provided £1 million of funding to support their work running campaigns such as Foster Care Fortnight. This not only raises awareness of fostering, but also provides a focus for fostering agencies locally to run recruitment campaigns. The impact of these efforts can be seen in the increase in the number of fostering households from 3,092 in 2008 to 3,989 this year, which is a significant and welcome rise.
Kenneth Gibson.
Thank the First Minister for his answer. Does he agree that one reason why we do not have as many people coming forward as potential foster parents is because of myths about the people it is commonly believed would not be considered as suitable foster parents, such as those in rented accommodation, same-sex couples, over 55s and people not in full-time employment? Given the rise in the number of children requiring fostering and the enriching experience it can provide for child and foster parent alike, does he agree that it is vital to support campaigns such as Action for Children's Fostering Myth-Busting Academy, detailed on its website?
First Minister.
I mean, yes, I do. And I like the Action for Children's description of the myth-busting campaign, because I think it has real impact, and we support that and endorse that, as well as other local campaigns, such as Glasgow's recent award-winning campaign, which focused on recruiting from a diverse population. Foster carers offer vulnerable people a safe, caring and stable home. We should do all that we can to encourage more people into fostering, and I hope that this particular campaign will see an even larger rise in fostering households next year.
Jane Baxter.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Given that local authorities in Scotland are using social work funds to pay external providers to foster children due to a lack of potential foster parents coming forward, can the First Minister give an assurance that the Scottish Government will address the funding crisis facing councils' spending in this area?
First Minister.
Well, I think the best methods that we can do is to make sure we see a continuing increase in the number of fostering households come forward. That seems the best possible action. But of course, we discuss with local authorities at all times the best way of meeting these important social obligations.
Bob Doris.
Presiding Officer, kinship carers do a tremendous job supporting some of our most vulnerable children. Can I ask the First Minister what progress is being made to better support them, including moving towards parity of support with foster carers?
Well, it's abundantly clear that the benefit system is failing kinship carers. That's why, of course, we legislated to recognise kinship care for the very first time, and we backed that with significant funding for local authorities to support carers. On 18 September last year, we announced a review of financial support to kinship carers to try and tailor support and tackle inconsistencies across Scotland. And these inconsistencies cause a great deal of angst to kinship carers. We aim to publish the findings of that review by the end of this year.
Question number 5, Jackie Baillie.
To ask the First Minister what action the Scottish Government will take to address child poverty in light of the findings in the annual report for the Child Poverty Strategy for Scotland 2013.
First Minister.
Well, any child living in poverty in Scotland is one too many, and it's encouraging, therefore, that relative child poverty is reduced from 21% in 2006-7 to 15% in 2011-12. The Government is committed to going further. We'll be publishing a revised poverty strategy in the spring, which will stress the focus on maximising household incomes and improving children's well-being and life chances. That will be backed by significant funds, including the £272 million collective investment in early years change funds, the £33 million we have committed, of course, to the Scottish Welfare Fund. But every single one of us should be aware that these figures on child poverty are taking place against a backcloth of welfare changes, many of which are bearing hardest and firmest against households with children.
Jackie Baillie.
Can I agree with much of what the First Minister has said, but the Child Poverty Report tells us that the progress made by Labour in slashing child poverty has now stalled, and I think we all agree that more needs to be done. Does the First Minister therefore agree with the words of John Dickey of the Child Poverty Action Group when he said, "It is absolutely critical that government in Scotland moves beyond describing existing policies and sets out how actions that can be shown to reduce child poverty are ratcheted up and rolled out across the whole country." What new action will the First Minister and his government take now to tackle child poverty?
First Minister.
Well, Jackie Baillie should acknowledge the £272 million collective investment in early years change fund is a significant new action, but John Dickey and no other expert on child poverty would deny that you can divorce the impact of welfare changes bearing down upon families from achievements in terms of child poverty. And given the straitened financial climate that we've been experiencing over the last few years, the reduction in relative child poverty from 21% in 2007 to 15% now is no mean achievement against that background. But of course, it doesn't go far enough. And this is why I have a real puzzle with Jackie Baillie's question. She's aware, she must be aware, that if you consider things like the children's child tax credit, working tax credit, the analysis of these welfare changes showed that 88% of the reduction, which the average, I think, was £700 per family, 88% bore down on families with children. That is what's happening under the UK Government's welfare changes at the present moment. And therefore, I find it incomprehensible when Jackie Baillie was in Newsnight on the 3rd of September that she managed to make the statement, you're not saying, she said, that you cannot develop a social security system in Scotland. You were saying that we should not develop a social security system in Scotland. So how can it be, when any person, any expert, any authority would acknowledge that the background of welfare changes bearing down on children with families has the most enormous effect on child poverty in Scotland, that the person who claims to be concerned about that goes and says we should not develop a welfare system in Scotland that will give children, all children in this country, an equal chance?
Christine Graham.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. On welfare cuts, I refer to child benefit, that excellent universal benefit with almost 100% uptake. This has been slashed by the Westminster Coalition, leaving families in Scotland with one child some £650 a year worse off, and two children £1,100. If his government had power over welfare, what would he do about child benefit?
First Minister.
Address the needs of people in Scotland in an effective and proper way. And Christine Graham puts her finger on what the vote next year is about. Either we build a more prosperous country and a just society in Scotland, or we allow Westminster to wreck the dreams and progress that's been made in recent years.
Question number 6, Murdo Fraser.
Thank you. To ask the First Minister, terminally ill patients with conditions other than cancer are given access to palliative care.
First Minister.
Well, the Scottish Government is committed to ensuring that compassionate, high-quality palliative and end-of-life care is provided for anyone who requires it, regardless of their underlying condition. And therefore, we welcome the publication this week of the report, How Good is Primary Care at Identifying Patients Who Need Palliative Care, from the University of Edinburgh, Marie Curie and NHS Lothian. And it's recognition, of course, of the Scottish Government's National Action Plan for Palliative Care. Now, we are examining how patients requiring palliative care are best identified in all conditions. One example is for people who have suffered heart failure, where we have established a national group charged with supporting improvements in the management of people with heart failure, which will include palliative care.
Member Fraser.
Can I thank the First Minister for his response? The report he referred to from Marie Curie, NHS Lothian and the University of Edinburgh found that 8 out of 10 non-cancer patients are not identified for palliative care, and those who do receive it often get it too late to fully benefit. Many primary care staff, the report found, have understandable difficulty, raising the issue of death with their patients. Would the Scottish Government instruct a review of the training and support for primary care staff to help ensure that more non-cancer patients access palliative care in the last year of their lives?
First Minister.
Well, that's a constructive suggestion, and I'll certainly see that it's considered. But I know that Murdo Fraser knows the report made 4 specific recommendations. One that he mentioned about the taboo around talking about death and the suggestion that the Scottish Government should lead a public discourse on that important subject. We agree and we welcome support for that initiative. The training of doctors and nurses, this should be included in supporting professionals to have conversations about these difficult subjects. We agree, and this area will be developed alongside the National Plan for Palliative Care. And the other recommendations that the report helpfully put forward, we think are extremely positive suggestions, and if Murdo Fraser would like to discuss matters in detail with the Health Secretary, then I'm sure that can be arranged.
If your phone's off and you keep it brief, Malcolm MacDonald.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. You'll never let me forget that. For the Government, a serious question: would you undertake to commit the commitment to patient autonomy, as for a very small number of people suffering from degenerative conditions such as MS or Huntington's, even with palliative care, the best of palliative care, they can find their existence to be unacceptable, and therefore would have the right to ask for assistance to end their life because they have had enough?
First Minister.
Well, Margaret MacDonald, of course, introduced legislation. She's pledged, as I understand it, to introduce it again. I'm sure the Parliament will discuss it very seriously and as a matter of conscience, and we'll look at her proposals as they come forward. But if Margot's inviting me to say personally that I'd changed my mind on the matter, then I haven't. But I think all of us recognise the seriousness and importance of this issue, and of course Margaret MacDonald's legitimate role in bringing forward these issues to this chamber.
That ends First Minister's questions. We now move on to members' business. Members who are leaving the chamber should do so quickly and quietly, and I'll allow a very short suspension for people to move positions.